Commissioner, we're broadcasting on YouTube now.
Yeah, thank
We're on.
Which did you use?
So that one, you have to have your browser open.
Some of that's changed recently.
Yeah, you should get, try nt.gov, and you should get the.
I'm not good at Brazil.
You got it.
Yes.
Yeah, what you do is, let's.
You're now broadcasting on YouTube, and I'm about to start recording.
Okay.
Thanks, Pat. So.
Oh, like about an hour.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you got your.
Yeah.
I'm broadcasting on YouTube, and I'm about to start recording.
Trying to do it. NCMMRJ. Yeah, looks like
Okay.
hit accept and then you're.
Thank you, thank you.
Somewhere back in my mind, I had a partial living.
Yes.
I want that. Jamie Anderson called.
Like, I
Right, last time I read it. All right, John.
Hi, great, everybody. Hi. Nasty.
Hey, John.
Hi, Mac.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
So Eileen, the link is also up and running now, so everything should be up and ready for you guys to start whenever you want.
John, we missed you at your own event that you were hosting.
Oh, you went, that's great, I'm glad you went. I heard people had a good time.
Let's see, what are we gonna say? Chris.
Here you go.
Thank you, sir.
Yup.
I think Chris McGrath is on the Zoom.
Brian, good evening. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah, no, I saw.
What are you?
Hey, Pat, can you change the screen so as I can see who's logged on?
That you're gonna have to press, so on the micro, on that silver remote,
Uh-huh.
hit the pound sign,
Give me all that stuff that they. all that stuff that you do. And she just.
and then press the number 1,
And she'll mail you a letter.
and then you should see a bunch of menus should pop up.
Nope.
I think they've already been around.
Okay.
Allison, you got them all ready?
All that's showing is a camera with a big X through it or a big red line through it.
So hit the pound button again,
Okay.
and now hit the number 1.
Okay. Change video layout.
Yeah, so hit the 2.
Oh, hit the 2. God damn.
You're from Zach Brown, so I can make it.
We saw that.
From Jim Hart.
He was over late on the road to Cheryl. Obviously, he's retired. So.
Yeah, we ought to try that up.
Tell me again, Pat.
So when you hit the pound button at the top, there should be something that says hit the touch tone, and then you're
Yep.
gonna press the number 1.
Yep.
And that should give
And
you all
then
those
I've-
menu options again.
So which one do I need? Change video layout?
Yeah, change video layout. You can only change it to a few.
All it does is it keeps going back to the camera with the red line through it.
Because right now I've got my video off. If somebody else were to start speaking, then they'd start showing up.
Oh, so we can't see who else is on?
Well, you're gonna see who else is on. So try doing the number 2 again. So do the number 1 and the number 2 again.
She was in California. I think he has to use his radio work.
Really?
340. 2 years later, it's just been.
Okay, can you just tell me who's logged on, Pat?
Right now, it's Cindy, Chris, and Charlie.
Okay.
So Charlie, can you say something? So you're
Yeah, you bet. Hi, Eileen.
Hi, Charlie.
Does
Yeah,
that help?
Pat, we're not getting the picture of anybody showing up. Chris McGrath, are you out there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, thanks.
Can
Oh,
you
there's
hear me?
Chris. Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Chris.
And Cindy
we're-
is Rich Gockel.
Okay, and we've got Rich Gockel, Commissioner.
I saw something from the hospital come today. I think
so
maybe
Eileen, did you want to try that one more time now that they've actually spoken?
Okay, perfect. Commissioner, we've got Rich Gockel and Chris McGrath.
That's what.
We're good, Pat. I know who we've got now.
Okay.
It's working.
I think we've got everyone that's gonna be here, so I think we gotta go ahead and kick off, and I think, we've got my job tonight is gonna be timekeeper. And I just have a couple of business items, and then I'm really gonna kind of push Brian and Dave along and other comments, and just make sure we're staying on track, given that it's the holiday week. I wanna get Eileen back on the road to Helena as fast as possible. A quick update, got a couple things. One is I've passed calls back and forth with the Parks Department on the idea of doing a tour of the FASs. And I'm gonna push pretty hard to get that done here before we get too much further into winter. And then the other good news is the Secretary of State got the recommendation that we made to the Commission at the last meeting up on the docket, so that is now scheduled for a telephonic commission meeting, final vote on repealing those 2 rules on December 15th. And then trying to think what other quick updates I have for you. So, hi there.
Hi, Abigail St. Lawrence. I'm the new Government Affairs Corporal.
Oh, okay, great. We just in the future tonight, it's fine because we got a light attendance, but we're really just have the work group sit here or present.
I understand there was a seat at the table, so I'll take it. Thank you.
Welcome. So with that, I'm gonna work with Brian here and just ask Brian to lead us through. And first off, I want to say thank you to Brian. He's done an incredible job of putting together this information and tabulating a lot of spreadsheets and bar charts and just extraordinary commitment, Brian. I really appreciate the work that you've done. And let's take a look at the workflow and talk a little bit about timeline and scheduling meetings. So I know you've done the past.
You just have to yell.
Pat, can you bring up Brian McGee's presentation?
The workflow one? I'm just about to start.
The workflow one.
Yep. Get to it right now.
Yeah, it's got right. Well, basically, well, he's loading the presentation, which is essentially following his handout. If we look at river recreation plans around the country and then in other countries, a lot of them follow a similar process. There's also an excerpt from the Wild and Scenic Rivers Handbook. All federally regulated recreation plans kind of follow a template. You can review this at your leisure. But this workflow, and this is just a discussion topic, right? So, but to kick off the discussion. So obviously here in the Madison, we want to have everybody enjoying and recreating and having fun. Next slide. And I think we're all concerned with, some of the publicity that Montana's had in a negative light. The New York Times ran a big article, Rivergeddon, and equated the Madison to Disneyland, and there's a recent survey in Angling Trade right now, has Montana lots of mojo. So we want to, have river recreation managed. Next slide. I think we're all sort of in agreement that we have to kind of balance two problems when we consider, this is, let's see, determine peak shoulder. Oh, that first one is, I should say, define the problem. But, we have social issues, and then there's also concerns, either now or in the future of fisheries, and do we have enough parking, stream bank erosion, et cetera, so pressure on resources.
Maybe the biggest one is fisheries, right? Dating back to our first meeting with this group.
Yeah, and it depends on the use. When we talk about like the tubing section, we're also really, overloading all the parking capacity, but the Madison's a well-known fishing river, so
right.
The fisheries are certainly something we have to pay attention to. This next category here, determine the use groups, is not trivial. And one of the very first things you have to do in a recreation plan when it comes to rivers is setting capacities. But to set capacities, we first have to define the types of visitation use, the types of users. And there's different ways to do that. We can think of fishing, and we can break that out into float fishing and wade fishing. A lot of rec plans treat boats separately. And if you're floating down the river in a boat, whether you fish or not, the number of boats are managed. So in Oregon and Michigan, in Oregon, you get a boater pass. Whether you fish or not, what's limited is the number of boats that go down to the chutes. Same in the Pure Marquette and the Pine River in Michigan. So that's something we'll have to carefully define, because you can't set a capacity until you define what the uses are. So this is just, again, a topic of conversation. We could change these definitions. With fishing, floating, and wading are very different. We have non-fishing floating. And the bear trap wilderness area, we float there too, but we probably should think of that as separate. It's a wilderness area. There's also some limitations to launch. That's also permitted in a very different way. Chris McGrath can comment on that. That may be out of the realm of FWP, but we may still want to make recommendations on that. The BLM may incorporate. There's also hunting access. That's very limited, and it's very seasonal. We may or may not want to choose to worry about that. Next slide.
Just curious, for those of you involved in the NRC process, was the bear trap ever part of that?
It was not ignored.
No, it was not.
From bear trap down.
Okay.
And
And I think, Brian, our recommendation in that case would be to the BLM, and we're really not, chartered by them.
we can get Chris's input on that.
Yeah.
Chris and I emailed a little bit earlier today, and I'll let Chris comment on that.
Right.
But it may still be beneficial to the BLM to get a committee like ours that looks at the entire river to chime in on some recommendations there.
Okay, so, and Brian, we've talked a little bit about this. Where in this process of defining the problem or the user groups is the geographical reaches that we're talking about described? Because they may have different user groups, they may have different definitions of the problems.
Yep, and we'll get to that section. That's a very
You don't think
important.
that needs to be up front in some ways?
Where you define like river reach or different management zones, we can talk about where we put that in the process for sure. But we have to talk about it because we do have to manage different sections of the river differently. Another thing that is often considered in recreation plans is seasonality.
Yeah, Brian. Was there a first part of this that was missing? Like define the problem?
Yeah, and I just realized I had it labeled incorrectly in the slideshow, but define the problem is the first step.
So, and so we kind of glossed over that, but Commissioner talking about what the NRC did, when the NRC first started, it was a big deal that it wasn't a biological issue. It is a social crowding issue, which goes to define the problem. And in the last couple of years, we're seeing, increased tick scars, perhaps pressure on the resource that is starting to be noticed. So I think defining the problem is paramount, right? And then, so are we, probably in the lower river, we might be, right? We're already breaking into geographic units, and then the problem's different down there, or it could be potential.
There's unique problems in the lower river that are currently not
We
as
probably
prevalent on the upper.
need to address immediately on the upper. And then geographic to NRC was from the park boundary to the confluence with the Jefferson, emitting their track.
Yeah. Okay. So seasonality is often relevant in river recreation plans. And to simplify things, I would argue or recommend we have to keep simplicity as a highly valued portion when we look at, if you look at other river recreation plans, the effective ones are, as simple as possible, still being effective. Seasonality is often a part of them. So for example, in the Grand Canyon, there's restrictions year round, but they have a winter season with lower capacity. And then they have two kinds of use, motorized use and non-motorized use, as just an example. And oftentimes, if you look at the BLM, guidance, there are certain times of the year where it generally set a capacity for every time of the year, but there might be times where you're so far below capacity that you choose not to have a permit system in place. And you could call that an off-peak window. For example, it would be frustrating to a fifth generation Montana resident to be required to buy a $3 canoe pass in February. Even though, so that would be off peak. Peak season is typically, maybe we're at a point where we need to set restrictions now or set some management now. And then shoulder could either be a window where for certain reasons, like different flow regimes or spawning or whatever, you may be at capacity, but a lower capacity, or you may still have a high capacity, but you might be approaching it within the next 10 or 15 years. So it's helpful to think about.
Peak is December, January. Is that?
We would have to define that, but
I mean, that's kind of the.
Thinking February is probably not going to be shoulder.
I follow you. That's
right.
what off peak.
And then where the boundary is.
Super low.
The good way to think about an off peak is there really a need right now to make people jump through hoops, especially
November,
the general
March.
public.
Right.
You want to make people go and
Thank you.
log in and reserve.
So I'm just kind of wondering, go ahead.
Just quickly, John, do you think that is November to?
I think that's November 1st through April 1, sure, or maybe even April 15.
I think we need to define the peak and then start looking that way.
That'll be a
And
conversation.
just a suggestion too, I mean, by breaking out into categories, whether you're peak, off-peak, shoulder seasons, or reaches of the river, doesn't mean we end up with a regulatory scheme that reflects those subcategories. We might end up saying, hey, those two get lumped together after we've analyzed it. But it's probably good to think them through with a little more
And it's
specificity.
also and it's also really important to point out that you may have a different peak and shoulder for a different use or in a different reach.
Right, and you may have different triggers for future.
Yes, in the Worm, the Great Cliff area, you may define peak as a different time of year than you do for the rest of the river.
Yeah, because lower Madison peak fishing is probably April through June.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so we're back to your original point. There might just be two of these, one for the lower and one for the upper. Right, I don't think it has to be overly complicated. But I agree that you would define these periods differently.
And again, your regulatory scheme, you might end up folding things back together. And simplicity.
Yeah.
But you also want to try to address what the problems are.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're two very different rivers, the lower and the upper.
And different time
or
frames.
even in the lower is extremely different in and of itself. The Bear Trap is extremely different than Worm to Great Cliff, and Great Cliff down is extremely different than Worm to Great Cliff.
Yeah.
So next slide. So those, we'll probably have to define something. And I'll get back to this a little bit later, but when we think specifically about fishing, fishing is kind of unique because we think about cumulative catch rates. Also on the river, there's a flow influence. We'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, but sometimes there's a lot more water and there's certain times where all of the river fishes really well, like late June, for example. The lower river fishes good all the way to the interstate. The entire upper river is clean and fishing well. There's times during runoff on a normal year, like in 2020, where some of the river's dirty and we tend not to fish it. There's some times where parts of the river get lower and you can fish the whole river, but there's some compression in the boats, from left bank to right bank. So there's some nuances about the physical flow regime that are relevant. Next slide. And we'll look at this a little bit later too, but we can also look at current use patterns. They differ a little bit from resident use to non-resident use and guided use. But we can look at what's currently happening on the river and take that into account as well.
Can we also break that out between like lower river and upper river for guided fishing?
This is the
entire
river.
thing, but
Yep.
it may again be
that will take a lot of work, but is possible. I can do that.
You can do that.
Yeah.
I have it broken out by
access point, or
you do it by launch site. You could.
I already did it for 11 through 18.
Yeah. It's not. It wouldn't take too much time.
If the lower is less than 10%
total usage. But again, during that April, May, June period, the lower gets a lot of traffic from Bozeman.
Yes,
Next slide. And I have another series later where we'll look at really detailed seasonal current use. So capacities are really important. And once we define how we're going to are we gonna set capacities for boating, for boat use, for weight angling use? We'll have to determine that. We may have a special zone from Warren to Great Cliff where we have a special pass or something, for that traditional tubing stretch. But capacities may be different at different times of the year, and peak, shoulder, off peak. We may also want to consider where we want to have higher or lower densities of certain kinds of use. So for example, in the Blackfoot River corridor, in their planning process, they define the lower reach of the Blackfoot for high density recreational floating, like tubing. And they define the upper reaches for a lower density floating experience. They're running into problems there because they didn't have any tools to enforce that. And so now it's all blending. So on the Madison, we may want to consider a zone from like Warren to Blacks or Warren to Great Cliff that is managed for very high density floating, recreational floating, and other areas that are lower density to preserve the high quality of wild trout fishing while still, so that's something may impact how we choose to define capacities. And then we may consider not only the social parts, but in activities like fishing, we may want to, do we consider the spawning windows? Do we consider hook scarring? Those are things we'll have to discuss. Next slide. And realistically, those first couple of slides are pretty massive. There's a lot to do there. I want to really emphasize in most river recreation planning, you start with capacity as kind of use. You don't carve it out into commercial, non-commercial early. So for example, if we define fishing as one kind of use, you set a capacity for all kinds of fishing. And then once you set that capacity, then later you determine, you've defined a pie, then you determine what part is guided, what part is unguided. And then later you have to figure out how you manage that capacity. And there's going to be maybe different techniques for managing guided users and different techniques or mechanics for unguided users. Those happen after you set a capacity for a type of use, typically. And then basically we look at a capacity and we determine in a certain time of year or for a certain use, are we already at capacity or over capacity? And if so, we need to think about mechanisms that will implement sooner rather than later to manage to maintain use below that capacity. There might be other types of use or times of year where we're under capacity, and then typically you set a threshold or a trigger in the future. If we do get to that threshold or trigger, what happens? You know, at that point, do we set restrictions? And that's also very similar to the federal guidelines for river recreation, setting thresholds and triggers. Next slide. And once you determine that something does need to be limited or managed or restricted, then you have to figure out how to do that. Is that setting an upper limit on guided use? Is it a turnstile when you show up at a boat ramp and sorry, it's parking lot's full, come back in an hour and see if it's space? Is that a permit system, a reservation system like they use in Michigan and Oregon for unguided users? There's also livery rentals. Sometimes you can allocate how many tubes can be rented per hour on the river. And so we'll have to determine that if we feel like limitations need to be set. We may have exceptions in some cases. Maybe there is something to consider there. So a lot of heavy lifting to do. Next slide. And we'll eventually have to determine a timeline. This is just an example of a timeline that might be implemented. We first have to figure out how we're going to set limits when limits are needed. And for example, if we set limits for non-commercial use, how is that going to be done? If that's through some type of online reservation system, for example, well, that needs time to be rolled out. Do you run it for a year without limits just to make sure it works smoothly and people are educated on it? But we'll have to eventually establish a timeline for rolling out whatever is going to be implemented. And next slide.
On the implementation, you can also set triggers for that. If you're monitoring and it stays below some level.
Yeah, so you could have a trigger. So for example, if you have a shoulder season that is determined to currently be below capacity, you can define whenever use reaches a certain trigger, that's going to initiate allocation or a reservation system or whatever. You could also have triggers going the other direction by, for example, if there's a new, crash in the economy and use plummets maybe for 2 years in a row and you're 50% below capacity, you could consider relieving restrictions. You can use triggers both ways. But there should also be a regular ongoing adaptive management. We should continue to monitor recreational use levels. It's really important to understand that a capacity is not a cap. A capacity is a target for a maximum level of use. A cap is a form of restriction that can be used. There's other forms of restrictions. And actual use is different than caps and capacities. So, sometimes you might have a reservation system where people reserve day passes, but not every day pass actually gets used. And same with outfitted use, like in the Big Hole Beaverhead, there's a cap on use in peak season, but the actual use is below those caps. So actual use and caps and capacities are different things. But we need to evaluate our trigger points being reached. There needs to be, regular refinement going on.
Right, this applies to all of the major blue ovals, right? You monitor and
you're going to have to monitor the areas where there's not currently limits to see if they've grown, if use has grown, where then limits do get triggered. You need to, if you're managing for capacity, let's say you determine for non-guided users, you're going to set a boater pass like they do in Oregon or Michigan. And your target is 100,000 boats. So you issue 100,000 passes, but you find out that not all the passes get used and the actual use ends up being 60,000. Well, then you may actually release more passes next year so that actual use stays under your target, but is allowed to increase.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's, this portion here is constant.
Should be frequent, whether it's every year. Some things might be every year. You know, you might evaluate certain things every 3 years. There should be a prescribed timeline of what gets evaluated.
And it should have, in my opinion, the monitoring or adaptive management should have identified like milestones and guidelines. For example, the feedback evaluation method on the BH2 is undefined, right? So everybody, at the end of 5 years, which was last year, by the way, and hadn't happened, the evaluation went through and everybody goes, hey, how'd it go? Oh, I think it went well. Okay, it went well. And then it's good for another 5 years. So there's no anything. There's no review of.
So what are you suggesting, Mike?
That they be defined. We have the evaluation plan in there.
Yeah, gotcha.
That it looks at, you know.
Critical
commercial
attributes
cost
and then engages
yeah, by reach or whatever we're managing for needs to be.
And then you got to go back to simplicity, right? And it's worthwhile looking at some other plans and, you know, like, well, fishing is important on the shoots too, but they just do a boat or pass. And so fishing is ultimately limited by who can float a boat down. You can float a boat down with no intention of fishing, but most people fishing to get to most of the river have to float a boat down. So they've kept it fairly simple, and that needs to be remembered too in this process.
Well, let's do this. Let's go through Dave's concept on the ambassador program, and I think Mac, you have some ideas on this as well, or Moga has. I'd like to come back to this one. There are a few things that you know, Eileen and I need to meet up with the folks in Helena about, you know, just exactly what kind of lead time are we looking at for implementation on a system for boat passes for rec use. I have no idea if that's a 3-year thing or if we can knock it out in 6 months, but I think, you know, maybe when I'm up there for the commission meeting on the 14th, maybe I come in a day earlier, we do it over lunch or something.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a question or if it's Deloitte or.
Yeah, we can certainly talk about it the 14th.
Anyway, I think that's a big, for me at least, a big open item. Like, what are, you know, there are a lot of them, but that's one of them. I think there's some funding questions that need to get answered kind of in the short term. And then, Allison, maybe for you and me and the others, the outfitters in the room know a heck of a lot about Beaverhead Big Hole, but I was wondering if it'd be helpful to have a session with someone that's really in it, like the largest outfitter over there, come over and chat with us about what they see as the real pitfalls. You know, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and, you know.
I thought I'd benefit from that discussion of just
One of the biggest pitfalls being an outfit over there since 1993. We didn't clearly define what the peak season actually was, and we just sort of arbitrarily said, okay, well, it's June and July. That kind of sounds like when people would like to fish the Big Hole River, doesn't it? And then we left this massive shoulder season available, which is just carte blanche. If you've got a license, you can do as many days as you want. We're avoiding that here, at least in our initial conversations, by actually with data identifying on the Madison River which months are the peak season. And we're looking at 3.5 months, not 2. And so I think that you said pitfall. I think that's arguably the biggest one. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, that's.
Well, let's not solve that one tonight.
Okay.
I think I'm just saying,
Anyway.
I think if it's beneficial, I think maybe our next meeting in January, I'd like to have Eric Thorson and maybe someone else that's.
Would you like to?
I
have
think,
this,
I don't think it's the biggest outfitter that, we've been working on that since 2017 and used all the BH2 permit pitfalls and issues to.
Well, let's offline. Between now and the next meeting, let's just make sure that we learn from the Big Hole Beaverhead, like what's really not working.
Agreed.
You know, we had a person in the public comment complaining about the extraordinary expense for new outfitters to come in there. And that, as the commissioner, is one of my charges with the arm that we're operating under. So we've got to make sure we keep an eye on that.
And if staff has a perspective on how it works.
Regulation.
From an implementation, that would be helpful.
Some things did work well and others
Andrew
didn't.
and
So-
Cheryl that were here,
Okay.
they work with Beaverhead and Big Hole too, so they could easily come and give the same detailed data presentation like you've heard on the Madison. So just let me know what it is you'd want on the Beaverhead and Big Hole. We can get the staff here.
Casey, one other thing that I kind of keep coming back to is top priorities. We're defining the problem and beginning to identify user groups is in some ways the lack of information on the non-commercial users.
Right.
And if there's, because we've got tons of information on the commercial side of things, we've got wide speculation on the non-commercial user, how they use it, when they use it, how much they use it, whether it's for 2 hours or a full day. If there's any other sources of information out there that can try to capture more, or that we can make it a priority to be thinking about implementing something a year from now that starts to get us more information. Because I think we're just operating in a big void.
Agreed. I've tried to learn a little bit about that, Dan, because you're right. That's a big, when you set capacities, at some point, you need to define a number.
Right, but we don't even know what that is. And the different uses can be very different. A wade fisherman for a couple of hours versus an all-day float.
Yeah, so there's a little more information coming. So there's another angler pressure survey. That one did break out asking, were you guided or not? So there'll be a little bit of that. There was also 7 cameras implemented on the river to count boats. So we'll get some of that. And you can then go back to SRPs and look. One other thought is if you required a pass system at some point for the general public, this is a big if, you could run the first year, require a pass without a limit on how many passes.
And just to get the information.
To get the information. And then you can still have a target. I mean, you are going to know some patterns of growth over time of how things are changing from now to calibrate that later. But you're right, that's a giant challenge that we'll have to
And it may
address.
even lead into the ambassador discussion of whether that's a tool that can potentially collect some information on the non-commercial users. So
you bet. Okay, with that, we're right on time, and let's talk a bit about this. I see Scott Vollmer here, and I just want to send out a special thanks to Scott for his editorial in the Chronicle. I thought thanks for setting the record straight, and I think it makes sense for those of us who live here in Bozeman. Dan, maybe you and I can meet with the editorial staff and just say, hey, look, we're trying to do our best, but let's not attack the work group for every
I didn't see it.
recommendation.
What issue was it in?
about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
And then Mike had a letter to the editor today.
Today's paper, a follow-up to Scott's, the two of them together, I think.
Yeah,
are
but
really
Scott, you
good.
did a great job
Thank you,
there.
Mike.
Thank you, Scott.
And Casey, I'd be glad to, having sat on the editorial board. I know the process and sometimes you don't have all the information. So
Yeah,
they're pretty open to.
I guess my
sitting
goal
down.
would be, let's just open up a pipeline so that if they have questions, we'll be here to answer.
Can I ask something, when something like that that's pertinent to the working group comes out, is there a way of distributing that or like sending a group email to all of us and say, hey, everybody, you may want to look at Chronicle today, good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah. No, I'm surprised we talked about it in the last meeting, the grand tree.
Yeah.
Because it had just come out.
It came out that day.
Yeah.
At our last meeting, whatever day it was, it came out, and then Scott was in about last week.
If
Scott,
someone sends
that's
the
getting
link,
the tour
yeah,
by
I'll put
Oh,
it
the big
on.
negative one,
Yeah.
but it's Scott's I'm talking about.
Oh,
Monday.
Monday. So that would
Will
be
do.
nice. But thanks
Fair
everybody
point.
for putting me down.
Yeah.
I'm here, I'm sitting here.
I'll forward it to you, right?
At least wait till I leave.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Fair point, John.
kids roll.
If anyone sees those, if you forward them to me, I'll put them on the Teams page for everyone.
It'd be great.
Because we haven't seen them either, so it'd be nice to see.
No, they were both well done.
So just a little setup on this. Many of us are aware of these ambassador programs and other densely used rivers and have seen it really work. I'm not suggesting that we go whole hog on this. I think this is a worthy concept that we got to be thinking about recommending a pilot program to the department, and we have some wood to chop in terms of figuring out how much it would cost and how it would get funded. But Dave has been really passionate on this topic for a long time and has been involved in early efforts on the Madison and other rivers. And thanks, Dave, for being here.
Well, thank you. So thanks, Casey, and the Madison, the work group for the opportunity to speak, and to Eileen for all the work you do, and Don and the staff for her service to Montana sportsmen. I've had my hands in the Madison, so to speak, for almost half a century now. I started thinking about that. That's sort of scary in a way. So I've been an outfitter and a guide since 75. In 79 and 80, I was on the Governor Judge Madison River Study Committee. It was somewhat similar to this, the years that we had moratorium on licenses. I actually was the first president and the founder of Foam, still a Foam member. I'm also a member of Montana Outfitters and Guides Association. I've been involved in TU quite a bit on the Madison Gallic chapter, and every job in the chapter, president of banquet committee and on the Montana Council. Also was involved in the Rolling Disease Foundation when I worked with Dr. Rice quite a bit and other FWP staff. I served as the foundation director of development. And then I worked for 6 years in Charter Limited on Aquatic Invasive Species program. I'm not exactly sure how I got that job. It was sort of when we merged the Whirling Disease Foundation, they decided I should have that. So I did that for a while. Then got involved in veterans work, the worst waters here in Bozeman and the Veteran Service Partnership, where I did use the Madison to help veterans with disabilities rehab. So the Madison River Fishing Access Ambassadors, the need, so the Creel census and mail survey results pretty clearly show that traffic congestion and behavior account for a large percentage of river user dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction gets formed at the access point and influences the whole river experience for a lot of people. Many of these issues can be mitigated through the physical improvements to the physical fishing access infrastructure. And you guys have done an admirable job in identifying those needs and the potential solutions. I think that's a great start because that's part of this. However, even the best designed FAS will not eliminate user dissatisfaction if they don't know best practices and protocols. So you can build the thing, but if people don't really know what they're doing, you're still going to have the problems. So many of these congestion river etiquette issues are created by well-intentioned river users who just don't understand best practices and proper etiquette. So I think the creation of this Madison River Fishing Access Ambassador Program combined with a robust education program would help ensure that the physically improved FAS will function safely and efficiently and help get the river users in and out of the river more quickly and help lower the level of stress and anxiety that have created this elevated level of river user dissatisfaction. So the primary role of the Madison River Fishing Access Site Ambassador, as I see it, would be to educate users in best practices, answer questions, assist users with launch and takeout procedures, help improve the traffic flow and the safety, improve the overall experience. It would consist of paid staff, would not be include law enforcement component, but of course, when necessary, the river ambassadors would have to work with enforcement if there were those kind of problems, wouldn't necessarily have a component of enforcement. It'd be more information, water safety equipment requirements, licenses, FAS, river etiquette, they can answer those questions. Serve as traffic managers to assure efficient and safe launches. And I've looked into some of the other ambassador programs around, and I think we have a very good program we can pattern after in the Missoula River Ambassador Program. It was implemented in 2021. They have kind of a unique situation over there. The region supervisor, Randy Arnold, actually organized this. They have a Three Rivers Collaborative. It combines officials from FWP, Missoula City and County, University of Montana, nonprofits such as Five Valleys Land Trust, Clark Fork Coalition, Missoula Downtown Association, affiliated business owners. It doesn't have decision-making powers, but they network and brainstorm, and they've done a number of variety of riverside projects throughout the Missoula River Valley. And I think a similar collaborative could be formed to help support this Madison River Access Program or Ambassador Program. Wouldn't necessarily have to fall on the department. Director Arnold in the regions at 2, Ellie? Is that 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Region 2, it was actually his idea to form the collaborative. They had meetings amongst user groups that were occurring more often over problems about rivers, and Randy decided that rather than just be reactive and wait till the gorilla was out of the cage, that they would try to meet regularly. So this group meets regularly to discuss these issues. In one of their early meetings, they identified a river ambassador program as low-hanging fruit that basically everybody agreed on. It was the first thing that they did. And Randy felt that it was beyond the capacity of his office to run that program. And so they identified one of their nonprofit partners, Clark Fork Coalition. They run it and manage it. So FWP is a partner. They provide the training and interaction like de-escalation. They have a IEDD training they provide to the ambassadors, how they interact with people at Access. And that's their part in the whole thing. After this, they've written a report. It's on the Teams thing now, and I emailed it to some of you. It's a different situation. It's an urban corridor. They're dealing lots of recreational users and tours, not so much with angling, but they still face some of the congestion, parking, distribution issues that we're talking about. They're similar, and they have the net of the 2021 was that it was an overwhelming success. All the partners agree. So they're doing it again in 2022. And Director Arnold did say that he felt a lot of the success of the program was related to the program actually being run and managed through the nonprofit as opposed to trying to run it through the region office. That was one of his observations. So in that regard, I've spoken a little bit with John Malovich, the ED for the Madison River Foundation. They have some interest in potentially helping to develop the ambassador program. So we had a little discussion before the meeting about that, but I think there is a way that something similar could be done to implement this. So the Missoula thing had a staff of 4. They all worked on Missoula area rivers. They were provided the training, as I said, by the Region 2 staff and managing the human interactions with those programs. Their primary focus was to manage the users, but they also did some data collection. And the leader of the staff is a young man named Charlie Reich. He's a very sharp guy. He got a software package somewhere. He designed a smartphone-based GIS program, which all 4 MRAs used to survey and document. They documented river use activity while they were doing the other job. And he said it didn't really interfere. They gathered some useful information to do that. That's something I think you could consider with the river ambassador. I think I'd like to see their primary job to help manage the users, but they can gather data, and they gathered some useful stuff. It's in that report if you look at it. So they found, when they first started out, they sort of showed up at access points and wandered. They had an identifiable uniform, hat and shirt and so on, and that was marginally effective. So they decided to set up a station. They set up an official station with materials. They wore the same uniform. As soon as the station was set up, the behavior improved. She said it was like immediate. It was that focal point for sort of authority, although they were not law enforcement. It was just that thing. As soon as some of the things they were trying to deal with, as soon as they started to go to this station-based thing, then some of the behaviors and things they were trying to manage actually improved that kind of on their own. They had business cards they passed out. They did a lot of stuff on social media. Their annual report points out that they're finding that their mere physical presence at the FAS helped establish an atmosphere of respect and civility where previously there was none. And so they were extremely happy with that. In addition to the On the River staff, they got an intern, I think, from the U of M, and the intern's job was they developed a pretty robust social media network. They had Facebook and Instagram pages, and that was their most valuable source of information. I'm not sure the user group's a little different on the Madison, but I still think that's an important function. Even the old guys like me use social media. I use it more than I do just web searches. And they often put on pictures. They updated conditions from the river. This parking area is full. There is no room at Doubletree or whatever they call these various things. And they found their social media platform use really, they got busy and people were using it to get some of this information. So along with the actual FAS program itself, the ambassadors, the vital component of that program was education. The message was simple. They primarily deployed it through social media, as I said. It was a message aimed at all user groups, and they had wasn't a total focus, but they tried to focus some of it on school-age children. On FAS ambassador, he suggested that we consider, sort of the Smoky Bear with a simple message, only you can prevent forest fire or something like that, that people could grab onto for river etiquette. Social media was their most effective method of reaching river users. They created a bunch of pretty cool hashtags. They borrowed a few. I found one that I liked that used on a Jackson Hole on a similar ambassador program, Don't Cramp the Ramp. There's a hashtag. Anybody seen that down there? It's kind of a cute one. So their social media platforms in Missoula were very popular. So the impact of this, why do I think this is going to make a difference? So I've worked a lot with veterans with disabilities, post-traumatic stress, and so on. And I've read some papers, done some studying. And there's a Dr. Herbert Benson. He's a mind-body medicine professor at Harvard Medical School. He studied relaxation response therapy for more than 50 years. He describes the relaxation response as a mechanism that can counterbalance the stress response. The relaxation response is the purposeful initiation of a physical state of deep rest, one that changes a person's physical and emotional response to stress. When practiced, the relaxation response slows down the breathing, heart rate, relaxes muscles, lowers blood pressure, and reduces the impact of stress-related hormones such as cortisol, which is your body, your adrenal glands make and release the cortisol into your bloodstream. It's often called the stress hormone. It causes an involuntary increase in heart rate and blood pressure and makes stress worse. And one of the things that Benson's in that, it's an attachment in the Teams thing. I got an abstract from his study. He ranked a bunch of therapeutic stuff that he looked at. He had fly fishing right at the top as the most effective stress-related therapeutic activity you can do. Recreational Boat and Fishing Foundation describes fly fishing as a natural stress reliever. We all know this, surrounded by nature, unplugged from electronics for the most part, just from the so-called real world. And these notions buttressed by some studies. There was a study done by a team of researchers, University of Southern Maine, University of Utah, VA. They studied combat vets. And they found that participants had significant reductions in stress and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and improvements in sleep quality after participating on fly fishing retreat. So whether you like it or not, if you show up at an access point, you get stressed out, you start to produce cortisol, you can't help it. And it's going to influence your outlook on things and how you're dealing with, it creates the fight or flight response in a human. So you get cortisol going up, so you want to fight or flight, you want to get the hell out of there and get on the river and get gone from this mess. So what the Fishing Access Ambassador program will do, combined with an infrastructure improvements, it gets people on the way and it gets them out into the environments where they get the benefits of this scientific evidence that what will happen to you when you get away from that. And you that do this know you don't have to be away from that very long. And I've done it with a Fitbit. I've watched my own blood pressure and my own heart rates drop after I've been on the river for an hour, as opposed to where they were when I first got to the access point, which is for a guide, combined with the stress of all the activity plus dealing with clients. So you get a double dose of it there. But mine goes down and it's noticeable. Blood pressure, heart rate drops within a short period of time. So the impact of these programs is it'll give the users a better river experience. I would also caution for us that use the rivers regularly, we have to be really careful about what we say and do in and around the users that we're guiding, because they're one man's crowd is another man's open spaces. And I tend to forget that. They get some guy from New Jersey who's used to opening day on the Mushkanackon where they're all fishing elbow to elbow. The worst of the Madison is better than that. And so.
Well, let's wrap up because I want to make sure we have time to discuss this.
So anyway, the same stuff occurs at the boat ramps. And so when you take out, you have the same kind of thing. The last thing I want to say, on July 1st of 2019, we had a meeting with FWP Director Martha Williams and members of the senior staff, along with representatives of Foam. Mike was there, Jason Fleury, and Mac Menard, Chris Francis, Scott Mahler from Montana Outfitters and Guides Association. We presented the program to her. She was enthusiastic, and at that meeting, she tasked senior staff to work at the point of contact to develop a FAS program. And so we're 2.5 years later, for a number of reasons, some of which is COVID, change in leadership, we still haven't implemented this. And I would just like to say, I totally agree with Casey. There's no reason not to do something. And this is your low-hanging fruit. It represents an accomplishment that I believe will have a palpable positive impact on river users and provide some good news on this. And I think we should do some pilot type thing summer of 2022. At the bottom of the report, I got a bunch of contact information and Benson's abstract on the brain is in there as well.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Dave. So I guess the question I have is does everyone feel like there's a need for this? What is it that we'd be resolving? And I think I know in the MOGA recommendation, you guys come out saying, let's start at Lions Bridge.
Yeah, I mean, Commissioner, this is, in my opinion, a no-brainer and has been a no-brainer for 2.5 years. And we've consistently leaned on the commission, the department, the powers that be to try to get something in place. If you objectively look at data, the only unequivocal statement in those surveys are that 70% of the dissatisfaction logged occurred at the FAS site. So that's unequivocal. So why in the world we're not moving on this as expeditiously as possible, I don't understand. Funding issues, staff, I mean, I get it. And then we have the COVID thing, I got it. But if we as an organization, as a group, can come together on this thing and actually put a shoulder to this, if that's what it takes, you know, to help raise money, to help coordinate, to help Dave and with some leadership stuff, I think we chalk up an easy win. And I think in the eyes of the public, it becomes really a responsible and positive move and a positive message. Highly visible, relatively low budget, and impactful. And if you consider what happens at our sites, they're more like, you know, you're going to see the same people after about 2 weeks or 3 weeks. The whole thing will have really impacted 80% of the people. And we have objective data. If we wanted to, you could even do even better by knowing what the average launch time is, you know, at certain sites. But you already have some objective data based upon user response, 70% dissatisfaction. And so I think, for my money, this is a absolute immediate first step. Get it done this summer and let us champion the thing, whatever it takes to help Eileen and staff get the support you need. I see that as a critical role. So I guess I'm pretty enthusiastic.
That's great. I mean, but what would you recommend for, you know, if we wanted to do a pilot program? Are we talking about one access site?
We actually have written up a strategy on it already and can share that. I thought Dave might have sent that. You guys had.
Yeah, it's on the Teams thing now.
So that is, and I wouldn't call that a Cadillac. I'd probably call it a Chevy. We could taper it back if we had to, but we could also enhance it. But I think it's a solid initial program. And that came from a lot of very experienced people on the river.
Another opportunity to look at something that's being implemented is the Flathead River Alliance. They have an ambassador program that they ran this year. They just announced this past week, securing over $100,000 for next year's program and to expand it.
Where did that funding come from?
It came, there's 4 or 5 sources that were listed in the news article. One was the National Parks Foundation. One was the National Forest, using some of the outfitter fees up there. There was another nonprofit, sort of like our Madison River Foundation, that's up in that area. And there may have been a municipality involved as well. I haven't seen the details, but if you go online under Flathead River Alliance, you'll see their website. And then there was again, a press release just this past week, but an opportunity on a river that has commercial guided fishing and floating and non-guided fishing and floating. They saw this as important. They ran that program this year. They've secured more funding for next year. I don't know, do you know what it cost for the Missoula, what their budget was this past year?
So we've looked into it, and one of the folks that we work commonly with has a company called GM Environmental for some of our consulting that they do for us on our projects sits on the board. And so I reached out to Tom to get some information.
Try to find that budget.
Board.
Yeah.
So we have that budget and understand kind of what we're looking at and how to compare that to, desired sites, total number of individuals, et cetera, just based off of their parameters.
Yeah. And that would, I'm sure Foam or Moga has some contacts on the Flathead of your,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Find out some information up there.
Yeah, I think we're at a point where we know the concept works. The biggest thing right now is what do we need to do to help make it happen? To help get it designed and help make it happen.
And not necessarily have to be dependent upon FWP to accomplish it. It may be FWP having a participant.
I think the Region 3 supervisor needs to be excited about it.
Yeah.
And I was kind of looking at the schedule for commission meetings. I think we could take a recommendation to the commission on February 4th. So unfortunately, it's too late really to do anything at the December meeting.
Well, Commissioner, it's one thing for us to recommend this course of action, but I don't think the commission actually has authority over the department's budget. And so it's, this is where it vapor locks just a little bit. If we have to go political and get political pressure brought forward, we can do it. If we want to do the collaborative thing and design it internally and implement it with the blessing of the department, things like that, I think are probably the more logical pathway, if that makes sense. It's going to be grassroots.
My opinion is it'd be a nice opportunity for the outfitting community to get involved in something like that and, contribute financially a little bit as well. I know I'd be interested in, helping our PR a little bit as we go into this, showing how much we care.
Well, it truly gives us an opportunity to tee one up and knock it out of the park, whereas 2 years ago, that probably wouldn't.
So John and I had a conversation and we got him going. He's an ED and thinks about this. He started taking off potential funding sources. That's always a lot of work, but the Madison is the crown jewel. If they get 104 grand for the Flathead, we have the potential of raising that same kind of money. And over in Missoula, they had agency support from FWP for training and not a lot of money. But we have city, county governments involved, some chambers of commerce, the same kind of thing, and spread out over a greater area. I think the funding thing, when you put your mind to it, is reachable. It's not an impossibility.
There's all sorts of granting opportunities, and frankly, the importance of this is massive. But like Brian put in his presentation, just seeing the press from folks like Angling Trade and the negative headlines, whether it's a negative report or not, there's negative headlines about Shangri-La or the Mojo being lost. This is a PR point that I think can't be spun negatively. I think it's just a great positive move in the right direction to create a better experience, to protect the resource that we all love dearly. So,
does anybody know total revenue from the 3% of outfitting trips? that was annually collected in 2019?
I know it doesn't come close to covering the cost of.
Do you know the number
running
though,
the
Eileen?
program. I can get it for you. I know we've been asked for that before. I know Mike, you've asked for it.
Mhm.
I can't remember, but I can get that for you. But it's
That'd be great.
I asked for it. we never got it.
that running basically the program, I've said this before, you know, the money that it's spent at the fishing access sites and the fisheries program, our funding is heavily subsidized with non-resident elk licenses. That we don't bring in anywhere close to the money just with fishing revenue. So that includes your 3%.
Would the tourism board be a source of funding? We pay our 7% tax for everybody who stays at our place. And
You bet.
If you do 14,000 trips at $500 and 3% of that is 210,000.
There you go. Thank you, Mike.
And just that, I know there's been discussion about why the department hasn't done it. We did have a package to fund the pilot program like Dave and Max spoke about, but it got rejected. So it never made it to the session. So, you know, we can't do it with existing staff. We asked for funding and FTE to get a pilot program going. I think I can't remember how many staff we were asking for, but basically to do when we met with Martha that time, but it never got approved.
Maybe we can do it this time.
Well, I think the model that Dave has presented via the Clark Ford Coalition with the Flathead Group as well is that FWP was there for training, for education, for certification, and then these other groups then were there to do the implementation and the execution. I think that's probably the easiest model as you talk about not getting stalled or bogged down because of those political or financial aspects. Having a nonprofit, an NGO, and a community run the program takes that away. So I think that's.
Does anybody see a net downside to this? Is there a downside?
Mike, can I just add, I think it's, you know, and Dave and Mike and I and others have spoken about this before, it's a great idea. One thing that I would mention that I think has benefit to having the more coalition type approach is having someone out there with an FWP shirt on doesn't necessarily elicit rainbows and sunshine. And speaking from experience, and you know, we've got our warden captain here right now. It's our staff, whether they're out there doing whatever it is, it's not often a pleasant response we get. So sometimes us being the ones with the badge on doesn't help. So I think it's a great idea, and we've spoken about it before. That's where I think the coalition effort that's happening over in Missoula, I don't believe they're wearing the bear head. Do you know, Dave? I know I spoke to Randy about it, and I don't think they're in recognizable uniform, but they're not wearing our uniform.
No, they're specific to the coalition, the
Right.
ambassador group.
Yeah.
And they
Which I
have
think is a
pictures
great-
of rainbows and sunshine on their
Right.
shirts.
It's like the Rainbow Sunshine Coalition.
Yeah, and maybe that's what we need to change our uniform to, and that would be better. Or just kind of like a target, but just a thought that for you to think about.
Well, Mac, will you carry the water on this one between now and the January meeting? Say,
And what is it that you want me to?
I just think putting flesh on the bones, because it's funny to say an ambassador, but I think, you know, I try to make it as narrow in scope as possible, make sure, absolutely sure it's a home run.
And who's the audience for this?
Get the budget. I think initially it's, I guess my point of view might be different than you. I think that we should report back to the commission on this and get the commission excited. And this is a recommendation from the Madison River Workgroup. And then I think we go to work on finding funding.
Is the Region 3 staff a critical
Target.
meeting early on in there?
I'm happy to reach out to the staff here and Eileen and I can follow up on that.
I'll write up, I'll take materials with hand in hand with Dave. We'll coalesce them, tighten them up. We'll come up with some outline of a budget. We'll bring you into this thing too. And then we'll have that available for you guys to review and look at.
Yeah, and maybe
In
a
advance.
brainstorm of
Okay.
potential funding sources.
If that would be terrific. And then we
John's
can-
already, I mean,
Yeah,
these guys and I met for an hour, they're really
Yeah.
on their way on that.
We
So
can
then we
really
should
put like
stand
a
and
white
get some
paper
ideas.
together that is a position paper from this committee. So if that's what you're looking for, yes. we can do that.
Mac, I would,
Layer specific recommendations per site, which we already discussed in our first meeting with fall.
Yeah, kind of per site. I mean, I think, John, just a total home run at Lions would be a huge victory in 22.
Sure.
Lions
You know.
and maybe Varney.
Barney.
And
Yeah.
maybe Varney, right?
I was thinking
What about
Barney
the-
would be a good one.
the
Yeah,
biggest
okay, yeah, closer to home. right?
unorganized launching sites are the lower river, like Warm Springs and
Yeah.
Blacksford. And there's the lease at least at Lions, people all kind of know what they're doing. They don't.
More so than.
They don't always at Warm Springs and Blacksford. I was going to mention just maybe checking with Chris McGrath at the BLO or someone at the BLM for some of their sites.
I was gonna
First
ask.
is funding and then comes recommendation, is that what?
No, I think we better have a plan, like what are we recommending?
Okay.
And then I think from what I've heard tonight, I think the funding for at least a pilot program would be pretty easy to raise money for.
We could do these improvements in stages year by year, not have to try to do them all at once.
One of the things that Missoula
Well, yeah,
found
let's
is
get a
they
win on the table on this one.
picked out an access that had the most problems and they set up and did their work. And after a relatively short period of time, that thing got cleaned up. So they started going elsewhere. So if you got Barney's where it was running, you could move this. I mean, it's a traveling feast, right? It doesn't have to be one place. And they only had 4 people. And they covered a lot of ground, but they said once they established these protocols and behavior, people got used to it. A lot of the users were repeat. Then it cleaned up. And so then they decided, okay, we're not going to go here is more, we'll go to Milltown, and they moved it around. So I like the idea of starting it in a few places, just a pilot program, and I'm more than willing to work with Mac and work with John. I do think that the collaborative way, after talking to Randy Arnold at District 2, I think that's the way to do it. And to not make this have to be FWP run or funded.
Right.
And to have the same kind of role he has over there. He's neck deep.
Flathead,
They
you
don't know.
got this, you got the thing down,
Yeah.
there are a lot of bones.
One challenge may be trying to identify by site or by user. I mean, the Upper Madison has a lot of similarity at the different access sites in the user profile. The Lower Madison is almost like a different educational program in the peak season.
Yeah,
Um,
it's more like Missoula.
Exactly.
Yes, it is. It's much more the floaters, not the fishermen, unguided.
It's a spatial issue as well as a temporal issue. That's what we talked earlier.
Yeah.
Safety.
So yeah, I mean, in some ways I'd lean towards kick the program off on the Upper Madison where there's a lot of
Controlled more.
similarity.
Yeah.
And maybe then roll it down to the Lower Madison, and it may be different funders as well that have an interest in the Lower Madison issues.
Beer companies.
Beer companies, anything that can float companies.
One of the major participants in the Missoula is the University of Montana. And they put in some funds, and they also decided that all their summer or seasonal student buses that were idle in the summer, where they still had to employ drivers,
Shuttling.
they put them out. And, the Lower Madison, the Montana State University has a big investment in Lower Madison. You go out there, and some days, 75% of the users are college students, and from Montana State University. So,
Okay, well, Dave, thank you very much. Great ideas.
I would have
We feel like we have a plan.
just add that cautious regarding funding, that we don't get locked into an ambassador program and 6 months down the line, we come up with a stamp program or something to implement, and someone like the commission or Fish Wildlife and Park and say, oh, you know, you used all your money on your basket.
Well, we're not gonna fund it with fish wildlife.
Right,
Or-
that's why it's critical to get these type of funding.
Right.
We'll have it.
Hammer down. Let's move.
Have some.
Let's move on. Question for the group. I mean, I think we talked about peak, shoulder, off-season. I think they're different for the upper river and the lower river. Do you think we could coalesce tonight on what those peak, shoulder, and off-peak seasons are for the upper and lower? I mean, we met with the number one, you know, outfitter for tubers on the lower, and when we talked about this to him, it was just like so obvious, right? He just said, well, it's based on water temp and sunshine. You know,
Primarily July, August.
yeah, it's or June 15th to, you probably remember the date I do, but I mean, for them, it's like June 21 to 21st of August, even before Labor Day. I mean,
Yeah, it slows down and well, the water starts getting cold.
he just said their business shuts down, they can close the doors. I think that one might be easier, you know, and then I think for me, the tricky thing, thinking through this topic is, you know, probably less the dates on this than the capacity constraints. So we talked in our last meeting, right, with a biologist and with Dawn gave a presentation. And to me, it seemed like the dates for the peak were pretty clearly 6:15 to 9:30. Is there any controversy around that?
On the
at
upper
all?
Madison?
On the upper.
Yeah.
No,
And then the shoulders, I mean, you threw out the off-season, John. Is there any controversy around the 11/1 to 4/1 on really the slow period
number one to what?
to April 1st?
I think that's,
I think-
I would agree with
I
that.
think that's inaccurate. I think March in the upper is well used.
If you bump into a crowded day in March on.
But we have the numbers, so let's use the numbers.
You're hitting a
Yeah.
rare
Yeah.
anomaly.
Yeah.
And why are we regulating around the rare anomaly?
Let's,
You want to look at some of
But
these.
wait,
If you live in Ennis, like I do a lot of the year, you'll know that March is winter. And
There's ice
you get
floes.
a 20-mile-an-hour wind out of the
Not
south.
every day, John.
how about we look at the,
Hey, Mike,
Yeah, but guys,
how about we look at the data? It's like, it's right, the answer is like right here.
What do you got?
I'm just saying, let's pull this graph up so we can all see it or look at this front page.
Thank you.
This will clearly define the shoulder when you just look at at least as a starting point.
so Kim, if you're still available, if we could go back to Brian's PowerPoint.
It's not on.
Okay.
Mark, Mike.
Thank
You
you.
got Alice.
It's on Pat's.
You'll never
or,
argue
I'm
that.
Sorry, it's on Brian's presentation. What slide is it?
It's the second
Take home
one.
maybe.
There's two presentations.
Okay.
That's one called out.
Hey, Pat, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'll put it up in a second.
It's a bar graph. What's at the top?
All
It's called, I
season,
think,
all fishing
use
seasonal.
patterns.
It's all fishing seasonal use at the top.
Does anybody else need?
All right, let me get back to it.
The PowerPoint's called, I think, user patterns or. seasonal-
User patterns, I think is what it's called.
All right, let me go find the other one then.
March is lower than December and February.
While we're waiting, I can explain where these come from different data sets. We have really rich data on like all commercial use, but this first slide is from the angler pressure survey. So this is extracted from from Hebgen Dam all the way down the river. So it's upper and lower. And the first one, and so this is, they send out, I believe it's about 60,000 surveys, about half of those come back. And of those responses, about 2,000 of those individuals said they fished the Madison. And then they're asked, how many days did you fish? What month did you fish? And so the first one is basically, you know, all users. It doesn't really break out guided or unguided. And the second slide is then resident anglers. This is just fishing pressure, not like recreational floating. So you see there is a big difference in the resident pattern. You get the spring fever effect in the spring and less interest by October. Everybody had their fishing days in and maybe out hunting. And then the next one is the non-resident only. These are again from the pressure surveys, and you know what we expect the summer season. And September is actually very strong. You can see a little bit of a difference in the pattern here. This is a smaller data set. Look at the next slide. This is a much larger data set. This is the SRC data, which is all fishing trips to the T on the river. I only extracted fishing trips. There is some guided recreational floating. I pulled that out. So this is just fishing trips. And you can see there's 2 years. There's a really dramatic difference in 2020. You can see in the spring, for obvious reasons, when the pandemic hit and there were lockdowns and restrictions, it was much later than normal. So the blue lines are the 19 season, which is the last normal season. That's probably the best one to look at for seasonal patterns.
And this is
The
all
only
river.
caution I'd make, if I could, on your assessments on you go to all season, you go to resident, you go to non-resident, and
Yep.
your comment was, and I think it's correct when you look at the distribution, but look at the scale. I mean, the highest peak is 120.
Yeah, you're right. And if you, and to back up your point,
Yeah.
Matt,
Yeah.
if you look at the next one, you see that, well, September is not the peak use.
No.
So it's a very valid point. You have a data set of 1,900 respondents.
Well, and just another data point, if you want to say, and John, you can chime in here as well. Lodging accommodations in Ennis aren't even open usually until April. We open in April and we just beg people to come. Well, El Western is closed during the winter and they'll open up in April.
They open in April.
Yeah,
Was this
because there's nobody out there.
Can we advance to the,
When do they close, Dana?
After the hunting season.
the river flow graph?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Keep advancing,
25 years, I've
One more.
outfitted something like 8 trips in March. 25 years.
And we're not even open.
This is one thing that I think it's important, especially for folks that aren't on the river all the time, to have an understanding of how the river itself changes. This is 2020, which is sort of a kind of a pretty close to average snowpack year. You tend to have a really big spike during the runoff window. And then what's really unique on the Madison is when the river drops and begins to warm, they release flows from Hebgen Lake until it begins to cool as nights get longer. So let's go one more slide. So obviously this 2021 year was a record low water year, but on the Madison, so we didn't have as much of a runoff peak as we normally do, but you see that with the hot weather, they did a lot of releases, and it's pretty typical that through August, they keep the flows pretty high, and then the river compresses to some degree. So there's an important seasonal pattern here to look at. And then next slide. And I have a handout here you can pass around too that summarizes this. This shows guided fishing trips over time. And you see that in 2020, there was a decline in total use. And October broke records in 2020, except probably for this year. But the spring use was very light for obvious reasons. So the industry in general, the number of guided trips declined. Next slide. However, use at access sites, these are vehicle counts, spiked dramatically in 2020. Now, there's like a 61% increase in vehicle counts at Lions Bridge. That doesn't mean there was a 1% increase in users. A lot of that was an increase in non-guided users, so there's more self-shuttling.
Or just people were wandering the state of Montana. And pulling into places.
Yeah, and next slide. So places like McAtee Bridge, or Black's Ford, right? We saw, increased vehicle access at all of these points.
And it should be noted that outfitter use trips dropped from 19 to.
Correct. Yeah, there was a 6% decline in outfitted use, but we definitely saw, as we all witnessed, a massive surge in just people coming to Montana. Next slide. And I just wanted to point that out as relevant because when we're talking about reference years, we want to understand that both 2020 and 2021 were massively impacted by the pandemic in terms of use. And so there's some summaries of car count data, which is rich. Again, this doesn't mean that there was a 115% increase in floaters. It just means there was a 115% increase at the dams of fly fishing access of cars going in and out. Next slide. And again, this is the guided fishing. It declined in 2020 by 6%. Next slide. Actually, stay there for a second. There is a go back one. There is an important nuance. The best of scenario, which has been approved by the commission for limitations on guided users, that number is higher than either 19 or 20 because some outfitters declined in 20, but others actually had the best year ever in 20. So when you given the choice, it results in a higher cumulative number. That's 16% higher than 19, which probably 21 is going to be bigger than that. But
when would 2021 data actually?
By about April.
April?
For guided SRP data. And I that's from Andrew. I asked him that exact question. So he indicated by April we should have it. Next slide. And we don't know much on 21 yet, but we have some early indicators just on visitation. Montana State Parks has released up to their second quarter in the month of June. All across the state of Montana, there was a 19% increase in 21 over 2020 was a massive 45% increase here. In Yellowstone Park, we have some 21 data. So June of 21 was up 19% over 20. And of course, I think July on broke all kinds of records in 20. And then we have seen, at least in regional visitation, up until October. In October of 21, there actually 21 declined by 12% versus 20, but 20 was up 85% over 19. So it's still elevated. So whatever that's worth, 21 was probably even bigger than 20 cumulative.
That's almost we're a destination, just like much of the American West.
Yeah, Canada was closed. People weren't going to Italy.
In those 2 years is no questionable value. Because we don't know, the real unknown is of these people who discovered outdoor recreation, how many of them will we be able to keep? How many will stay with us?
It could decline. I mean, as Europe opens next summer, as Canada will be open, this could have been a bubble, but we also introduced a ton of people to the sport.
So it'll be really,
we don't know.
Casey, back to your trying to get some schedules here. Let me see if I could summarize what I'm hearing. On the upper river was peak season, June 15th to September 30th. Your shoulder, if you want to say that has more usage, is October, and then April, May, up to June 15th. And your off peak, off season is sort of November 1st to April 1st. Would that?
Yeah, I would say June 15th is definitely something to.
It's depending upon the runoff, that's when at least the upper Madison kicks into higher gear.
And following that line of thought, it might be suggested that there would be 2 classifications once we go to capping outfitter use and or non-commercial. Let's leave that aside. That you would have 2 categories of days. You'd have a shoulder season, which would be April, May through June 15 and October, and you would have peak season days.
But even for, and I think those are some options there, but as we're thinking about both defining the problem, looking at usage in those seasonal periods.
Yeah, that's right. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Could be helpful, and then we kind of go there. And I just, throw out for the lower Madison 2 different peak periods. One being for the recreational floater, which is probably that June 15th to the end of August or someplace.
Say that again?
Say June 15th to the end of August. I think it's probably more around July 1st. You usually start seeing them, but
Yeah.
a warm year, it can be a little bit earlier than that. And it can go up through Labor Day. For fishing, I see the highest amount of usage being in that April to June 15th period of time.
Down below.
Down on the
then again
lower,
fall in
and then
September.
September to October.
It's hard to find an angler in July and August when
It's in between
bathing
the-
suit hatch is going on because nobody wants to be out there.
What's interesting is you do see some commercial users and non-commercial users in the summer doing early morning floats on the lower Madison.
Or lady.
Or
Late.
lady.
It depends on the flows too, like on a good water year, yeah, you can go out.
But I wouldn't call it the peak period for fishing that section. Now, there's a difference in that lower part of the bear trap. You've got float users coming through the bear trap, which is fairly limited and self-regulating. You better know what you're doing or it's going to be search and rescue. But you also have a lot of people that walk up.
And that can be good fishing up there.
And fairly isolated. It's again, sort of self-selecting because you're hiking a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles to get in. Rattlesnakes and poison ivy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of like FWP's recreation management, let's say there was angling limits, like weight angling limits. Does FWP have jurisdiction on like just the whole river on something like that, even in places like the big bear trap? Or is that exempt?
No, it's the entire river. The way to think about it is there's a difference between sort of restrictions at the access site. So obviously that varies by the land manager. Obviously the fishing access sites are under ours, the BLM under theirs. But if we're talking about, use for, say, just thinking out loud, if you wanted to do something similar to the SRP program, but for non-commercial or non-anglers, we would probably do something similar like we have with like a joint program with the BLM. That would be sort of the easier way to do it. But it doesn't, I guess what I would say is sort of, like I've said before, think about the sections you want to do your controls on or restrictions on for what user group, and then we can, once you get that figured out, we can help you figure out the mechanism to do it, depending on where it is. But you have authority to make the recommendations on commercial, non-commercial, angling, non-angling for the entire river. Does that help?
But that really wasn't envisioned in the arm that you guys had not looked at capping the lower river for.
It is envisioned in the arm. It's specifically mentioned, capping or I can't remember the exact words, but basically user restrictions on non-commercial and non-angling use. It's all well within the purview of the work group.
Okay.
The work group has purview over any recreation on the river.
Great.
Well, Eileen, thanks for the clarification and the help there, but I would just lay out for you that, at least as I sit here right now, I'm interested in taking care of the big stuff. I'm not interested in spending a whole bunch of time on 10% of the use on these little side deals. Somebody's gonna have to make a pretty darn compelling argument that the boogeyman is gonna come get us. I care about the big chunk. I care about this kind of stuff, And so I think if we caution ourselves about all the little rat holes we can go down. Let's take the big pieces first. Let's attack the big pieces. Mike's got some incredible data.
Following that, Max, looking at graphs I did for the MRC, it's earlier when I said I have the numbers for use by reach was commercial use. So in 16, 17, and into 18, it was over 78% of commercial use was lines to Ennis, right? And less than 10% in Lake to lines, because we're dealing with the walkway issues, and then about 5% for Ennis to Ennis Lake, and then right around 10% for Warm Springs to.
Basically lower Madison.
Yeah.
So less than 10% of all commercial use of these areas.
We gotta do the commercially guided trips, because there's huge commercial use in the lower Madison, but it's a livery service.
Right.
That's a different category.
These are commercial fishing trips.
So along those lines, just, I'm not advocating a position on this, but one of the values of kind of breaking out the thought process between upper and lower Madison, including for commercial guided, is do you have a separate, does that 10% potentially get, allow them to do that? They could transfer their usage from the lower Madison to the upper Madison in the peak season.
If we break out this spatial and.
So I'm just throwing that out as it's a complicating factor, but it's something that we want to think through the unintended consequences of how we create a regulatory.
Right on, because this is something that, this is where, knowing what's going on in other permitted rivers like Bitterroot, the Bitterroot stops at one of the upper Bitterroot. And there's no SRP or permits below that, and use through the roof. As soon as they implemented the permit system in the upper without permitting below.
So that's just
on the West Fork.
think through it.
It.
Right, well, it's upper Bitterroot, West Fork.
And I think one thing to think about staying higher level, the SRP is for the whole river. When you just look at commercial, it is for the whole river. So to keep it high and simple, I would push to start with just that, what your SRP's already earned you or gotten you, and stick with that. And then maybe we figure out the non-commercial or the recreation.
Another way to think about it is you have a lot of fishing trips. They're spread out across the river, heavily, upper river, but there's some in the lower river in the seasonal windows. But you have then this very intense recreational season from Warm Springs to Gray Cliff. And you could carve that out as a separate management zone and have another layer, of access, very high density recreational in both space and time. So, in that mid-June through Labor Day weekend, that zone could be allowed a very high level
for recreation
of non-fishing recreation. You could still have fishing recreation, and that you'd have to have an SRP for guiding, and you'd have to have maybe an all-access floater pass that lets you fish anywhere in the river, including that zone. But then there's a separate pass which you have in spades that allows tubing in that zone only, and in certain dates, very high capacity.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
You can't look at just how many users there are though, from the presentations we had last meeting, that something is happening on the lower river trout fishery. And they have identified it as, I'd say it's pretty clearly not commercial guided trips, right? Messing with the lead frequency curve for juvenile trout. And, there's no fish under 6 inches and no fish under 20.
This opens a good door, and I kind of held off on this, but I have a hard time thinking that we are going to address stock conservation problems of any species on this river through a recreational use plan. That's not how you do it. You go specifically to seasons, bag limits, methods and means, hook sizes, spawning season closures, the cadre of tools that make up a fish manager's toolbox. It isn't how many days people go fishing. It's if there's a spawning season closure that needs to be in place, then it needs to be in place the whole time. Because the disruption by 100 anglers isn't a hell of a lot different than the disruption of 20 or 30 or 40 anglers on the spawning grounds. And so the idea that we're crafting this to solve a stock conservation problem is probably not real accurate. We are addressing a social issue of a perception of crowding or measures of crowding. If we have conservation problems, we are going to look at reductions in season length. We're going to look at hook sizes. We're going to look at single hook artificial lures. We're going to look at catch and release only. We're going to look at spawning season filters, things like that. That's how you do it, right?
Which was the first box,
yeah, exactly.
The first slide today.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, what influences pressure or use or anything having on the resource versus is it just social crowding? I think a lot of the information we saw last time, though, on the upper and increasing hook scars, sort of inferences is that the resource is being impacted in some way by use.
Yeah, and hook scars are an interesting attribute. I've done a lot of work on hook scarred fish, you know, and condition factors and that type of stuff. And if we want to address that, we're talking about hook size. Not talking about getting rid of tubers, getting rid of, you know, some level of fishermen. That's not going to do it. It's a hooking thing.
And there, yeah, and
we're going to come back to that.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think this,
bugs.
again, you just got to go back to, I think, the people and how that can influence. And we look to the guidance of FWP who manage the conservation or other groups. That's not really with our scope, I don't believe. I believe our scope is to support social practices that preserve the health of the river, but not to make those decisions here in this time frame. We got to
actually think, and then I'll shut up, but I think we actually could come up with a suite based on data that was presented last meeting, the quality of information that's available to define what historic stock composition looks like, which is what our expectations are predicated against. Our historic size and age composition, what we want to preserve, right? Then I do think we have a segment of what we can be looking at as just basic recommendations to the department and the commission. But it's clearly their purview. But our main thing is to address this stuff.
Back to the, you know, I feel great tonight. If we could just nail these shoulders. Well, we haven't done the lower yet. So as you think about.
When we talk about the lower, can we be more specific? Because the lower means from like, you know, Ennis Lake. all
I'm
the way
talking
to
about Warren Springs all the way down to the interstate.
Well, but when you go past Great Cliff, it's also very.
Great Cliff. Yeah, and was there ever talk about capping commercial trips below Great Cliff?
Yeah, there was.
It's cumulative. Well, it's cumulative.
Which made no sense.
Okay.
Yeah. There was an MRF prior to John.
Yeah.
But that might be the rat hole.
That's true.
That's a rat hole.
It's minimal usage.
I mean, where I'm going with this, right,
Very
is, hey, well, this is gonna lead a path to the capacity constraints that we're gonna set in place for both commercial and non-commercial. I think, you know, when, I don't know, 2 months ago, I talked to someone in this room about, you know, we had to differentiate between peak and off-peak, and, you know, that was a big issue. And I think, I'm really pleased to see that this group has kind of come a long way on this.
So what was the consensus on the upper of the peak?
So I think
the
it's
shoulder?
6:15 to 9:30 on the peak. Then you've got the shoulders at 4:1 to 6:15 in the month of October. And back to Mac's question, at some point, we ought to really look at spawning and whether we want to grow those shoulder periods or potentially close some parts of the river. And then the off-peak or off-season, that's swath from November 1 to April 1. I think that's supported entirely by these bar charts.
Yeah.
And I guess as I think, I pull back up to 20,000 feet, I'd say probably no need for a cap during the off season. I think we ought to probably think, forward about how we're gonna, is it a 50% growth that we're willing to sustain in the shoulder, 100% growth? I don't know what the number is. Probably from Great Cliff to the interstate, 100% growth would be just fine. And then on the upper, the question's gonna be, I think the arm was the best of 2019 or 20. Brian's argued that we should just use 19 because it's the most normal year, and then feather that with a growth factor, and whether that's 16%, which was an average that got to the best of 19 or 20, that's one thing. Or I think this group could say, we want something lower than that.
Well, to clarify that, like the thought is picking a year to refer to. So
I know.
Yeah. So 19 might be a year you refer to.
Yeah.
And you could then 50% or 100% or.
And also, I just, maybe a clarification for me to understand, there's references back to what the commission in the ARM referenced of 2000, the best of 2019 and 20.
Right.
They also had the rest in rotation and other things there.
Totally.
It seems to me we have at least the range of discussion that can look at refinement of those numbers. Or as we get into these sections, into
Yes,
peak
define the
and
section.
off-peak areas there. So I find it less helpful to just keep saying, well, that's what the commission has approved.
That's fair.
There, so.
Just, what I think of it's a starting place.
It is,
right?
I agree, I just
Yeah.
go on record that it's not my ending spot necessarily.
Okay, fair enough. But you're good with these dates?
Oh, yeah, I think, I'd say the dates on the upper Madison, I think we have an absolute, everybody's saying yes on that.
And I guess, getting back to the rule that was, voted on by the former commission, they left open this, whole playing field where you could have dates in October and move them into July.
With a lot of unintended consequences.
Right.
That could peak.
Right.
usage.
As I look at this, I think we all agree, right, that we don't want to grow the peaks in the bar.
And again,
right?
it goes back to the defining the problem, which was primarily a social conflict driven problem. We have some data on what the impacts on fisheries may be. But
is there any habitat degradation happening down in the lower based upon all the shot?
There's a little bit around the access points,
I mean,
especially around Black's Ford.
That doesn't seem to get much attention.
Mm-mm.
But habitat degradation, fishing effects can be there's resiliency, habitat loss and degradation. That's a longer term one-way trip.
Has anyone looked at that?
I don't know. That's my question.
We spend a lot of time on habitat, so it's an unfair characterization to say it doesn't get much attention. That's our main focus for all of our fisheries, especially when they're based on wild stuff.
Anything specific on the lower Madison?
I'd have to check with the local biologist, but, and now, with fishing access sites being moved to the new division, we're already starting to work really closely with them on protecting and preserving the habitat near and around the sites. Like Brian mentioned, yeah, there's certainly degradation around launch sites. That happens in most places. Then you get into this argument of to riprap or not riprap, because riprap causes its own problems. But we have a whole bureau purely based on habitat and.
So Eileen, the question I would have if we look at the lower river and we look at habitat degradation, and I'm thinking beyond our constructed footprint.
Yeah.
That would influence my desire to address these large peak of floaters. Otherwise, if there's no habitat degradation, they have, no measurable impact on the fishery itself. It could be a policy that says, hey, that's a place where, I forget what the terminology was.
High
you're
density.
using.
High density
High
recreation.
density recreation can happen,
So
but
if
it
you
can only happen
remember,
up to the point that it doesn't degrade habitat.
so if you remember back to Mike Duncan's presentation, at each of those sample points that Mike showed you the charts for, they do a habitat assessment at each one of those. Mike didn't get into it when he gave his presentation because that's a whole other presentation in of itself, but Mike has a habitat assessment for every location they spot and collect, they stop and collect fish at. So we can certainly get that for you.
But it would be worth it visiting, I don't want to add to his workload, I'd be more interested, and I think this body's really interested in the lower river, particularly during those peak impacts.
So just, it's how we manage all of our wild trout fisheries. They're managed based on habitat first because we don't stock them. We haven't stocked them since 1974. So our focus is on habitat. So if that's something you're interested in hearing about, I can certainly bring staff in to give a presentation on that. But it's a large part of what all of our staff do.
I'm guessing that it's water temps and water quality down there.
Well, he had referenced boulders,
Yeah.
he had referenced a couple of others.
Yeah, Mike does a habitat assessment at each location.
Okay.
A related,
Excuse me, Dan. Unintended consequences. I'm a strong proponent of high-density recreation in that Warm Springs to Brave area. Let it have at it and let that be the place where they go. They being the inner tubers, because you cap that and like, oh, well, we're still gonna go. Let's go up and go Lions to McAtee. Because they're not gonna let us go down there anymore. So you really have to be careful of that. There's places for everything, right? The sacred fly fishing grounds seem to be the upper river. The recreational tubing seems to be the lower river during that time. So I don't think we wanna push water upstream, as the old saying goes, and fight those trends too much. We wanna notice those trends and then do our best to manage them. But if we start capping that inner tube use on that lower river, they're just gonna go.
John, to that end, Brian and I had an interesting conversation with Montana, the owner of Montana Whitewater. He's totally agreeable to banning livery services for that kind of wreck use on the upper river, and understands that, hey, this is a precious resource. And
terrific.
And I think there are new players in that business that may not share that point of view. And I think, I think this group wants to get out in front of that pretty soon in 2022 with a recommendation that we ban livery services on all the equipment in the upper.
Casey, in that discussion with the Montana Whitewater, was there any discussion about public safety issues? One of my biggest concerns on the lower Madison is all the cars being parked on the roads, people hitchhiking back and forth to get their vehicles. And then we live just off of Norris Road here near Four Corners. And the Highway Patrol now, or the sheriffs, are regularly setting up speed capture for people coming in off the river during the summer. And I don't know if there's any database of either from Montana Highway Patrol, Gallatin Sheriff, or Madison County Sheriffs of just incidents of public safety related to the lower Madison. And I'm not wanting to use that as a hammer, but as a sensitivity, there are issues there.
And you may, even managing it for high density use, you may still need to put limits because
on the road.
Yeah, people spilling out, there's that, which that's something that will have to be.
Or it even goes to the ambassador program of eventually on their, what are the etiquettes, what are the safety things?
Dan, I was at the Blackfoot user meeting last week. That was in Taylor today as well. And the river ambassador people were there. they had similar issues with the lower Blackfoot, people coming out from Missoula. They used to terminate the ban. They encouraged the tuber use on whatever foot end it was. I don't know the foot end as well on that lower river for all those reasons, parking and safety. It was influencing the experience of the upper river users, which are more fishing oriented. And he did a great job. We talked about they have free shuttle services to those lower ramps.
Well, like the U of M helping on the Clark Fork River there.
Exactly.
Or if the associated MSU group could do something to help, that cut down on drunk driving, on cars.
Just give me some insight, go back to the peak season on the lower for fishing, just for fishing. I mean, does that really start, I guess I'd look at rec, the bar chart. Is that a 4:15 to 6:15?
I guess before you ask that, the question you're going to sort of match thought processes. Do we have a crowding problem with anglers on the lower river ever?
Yes, you do.
We do?
It's Mother's Day caddis hatch. Everybody is
and
there.
in September, when the water drops, the fish go in the buckets. There's a lot of friction. Because it's an amazing, spectacular fishery.
You have a crowding problem.
Yeah, and I think the question came
But
up.
it's not self-regulating.
What
The question
was
came
that
up,
reflected in the
start
survey?
regulating the upper, not the lower, then also the lower should explode.
Okay, but let's assume that there is a crowding problem.
On the fishing side, there is, it's more so in the fall, like what I hear, the feedback and the frustrations when the water's lower. Because the fish kind of go into buckets and then people stop and work water and there's only so many buckets of fish. And so there's frustrations of
So the question is, when is the peak season? And then it's April, May.
I don't know if
And
I'm
the first 2 weeks of June.
I would say
it's everywhere that
it's until the fishing
baits
is no longer
are not.
good. In some years, it's really good through like July 7th on a high water year. And in other years, it's done by the third week of June. Most of the time, about July 4th. So there's a little window where there's a lot of tubers. Here's one idea I had on. You could define that peak for the whole river, except for bear trap. That's a different animal. For regular recreation floating, fishing floating, wade fishing. Because if you break the river up into all these parcels, and then you tell someone like from the general public, you got to choose where you're going to fish. You got to get a pass maybe a month out. You could just let them have a fishing pass and they can fish anywhere they want. But then you could have for the high density float use, which is only specific to that reach, there you could have a different peak, right? That could be June 15 to August 15th. Does that make sense? I mean, it would simplify things. You would have this special recreation high density zone with its own peak where you allow that high density. And in the spring and the fall.
Constantly, I have a home in Bozeman and I have a place in Ennis. I'm constantly driving through that section. And I never see any crowding in October.
No, there's not.
Sorry.
And even by September, it's over, right?
Even in September. And you never see an angler out there in the July and August, because who would ever go fishing then?
Well, you do in early July. I think you go really early.
Okay, a few, but again, we're not talking about Lions Bridge on the upper Madison. We're talking about.
You're not.
But my point is, you could define one simple peak shoulder off season for the whole river, right? For everything except the high density tubing use.
Okay.
And then that would have a separate peak season when you allow that very high capacity. So you allow that super high capacity.
What are you saying, Mike?
To what end? Why are we defining?
Because you're going to use that to, because it's a spectacular fishery up through July 1st and from late August on.
It's a good fishery as well through August.
Sometimes, some years.
My observation, and I'd be interested to see or dig back through some of your statistics there, but I would suggest the peak usage from my driving by it all the time for commercial floaters is probably early April until the end of June. from a fishing perspective.
That's what I.
Well, September is pretty intense.
But
I don't,
if it's
late August,
10% of the
September.
entire use.
Yeah.
Is it something we need to look at? Do we need to define peak commercial fishing below it? I don't think so.
I agree.
Yeah, you could just define the high density window for the overflow of like have huge capacity for.
Hold on a sec, Mike, so you're saying that we won't need to cap that? I thought that was.
See, and that's enveloped in the overall cap.
Right.
Whatever the outfitters are doing, it's already accounted for in their.
SRP, yeah.
Yeah, except that this is gonna be totally line up more with the shoulder season. And
But we don't even, all we've
We're not-
defined is a definition. We haven't defined,
We haven't set anything.
yeah.
Defining a shoulder, that's the point as well. I think we're all like going down the line.
Yeah.
I got my 37 days and I want all of them to peak and stand up 5, 15 shoulder season. I think we're going way ahead of us right now. Which brings my question originally is, why are we defining off-peak, peak and shoulders in the option right now? And the idea is,
That's where the critical moment is, that we're not having crisis in these off months. And so we're charged to deal with the problems at hand. And there's no problem at hand in December. So why are
similar to, there's no problem commercially on the lower through the year, right? That's what we're looking at.
Right, we're looking at where the problems are, which is peak.
Right, and there's not, it's a non-issue in the lower. It's a non-issue in November and the upper.
Yeah, these guys, some of the folks are saying that there's crowding on the lower in April.
I would suggest we get some better data to look at the number of launches in that period of time and just compare it.
Mhm.
Because I drive by and Warm Springs, there are 15 boats lined up to launch in April and Mother's Day Caddis Hatch.
I've seen that, yes.
You know, so I'm not making a judgment call, but I'm saying we should look at those numbers.
Yeah.
Fall does get really busy down at Warm Springs from the outfitters as well, though.
We have the number, that's full now.
And we don't need to solve that today,
Right.
but maybe
It's a
look at
component
that.
of, I mean, it might be crowded in May at Warm Springs, but it's a component of what everybody commercially is using on the entire river. It's still only 10%. It might be everybody's there, kind of like Alliance, everybody's there on that day. Getting crowded, but overall, it's.
Yeah, I think we're gonna get,
10%.
like, we're just making it too complicated.
Mhm.
Like, break it. I think you define a high density rec zone and then, you know, that's its own sort of animal of extra passes or whatever, or you don't have a limit on tubers or you do it just but the rest of the river, you just pick sort of, you know, peak shoulder and you let people, you know, they want to go to the lower and fish, you want to go to the upper and fish. Is, you know, they fish. Because what's going to happen when you go to non-commercial passes is it's much simpler just to say you got to pass, you can go fishing, right? Versus saying, oh, you can only fish on this 9 miles, but you can't, you know, that 10 miles is already booked.
That sounds a little bit like big rat.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of keep it simple. And that's the.
But again, what we eventually get to as a regulatory scheme may be different than how we at least define the problem or the stretches that we want to talk about.
Right.
Sure. We don't end up with.
Just because you defined it doesn't mean
You regulate it. Exactly.
Related to that, yeah.
Well, we've got the upper, is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're kind of like, I guess, a free-for-all in the lower.
It just kind of sums it up.
And I think the other thing to be super clear about is that whatever SRP permits or history someone may have in the lower river do not transfer to the upper.
Well,
Is that correct?
Oh, currently they're one.
And that's one of the questions.
So that's
on
the
it,
issue.
Would be one of the questions down the road for us to discuss.
I think you want to, because, you know, when you have like a good water year and the lower is fishing well, you want to encourage people to, most of the use is on the upper river, right? Most of the SRP permitting is going to be
90%.
you know, if you broke it out that way. But what on those years when you have good flows, like even if there's a lot of tubers, don't put on until like 11. So you can get on way ahead of the tubers, and once you get past blacks, there's not many tubers. You can have a great full day of fishing, even on a day that's going to be busy tubing. So those years, like we had like 3 or 4 years in a row where it fished great for until about July 15th. And you really want guided users to go down there when it's fishing well, because it just spreads people out. Right? It takes them off the upper river.
Okay.
So that's my point, is like when it comes to the fishing stuff, let's have one season, one peak season, one shoulder season, one pass. When it comes to the general public, they just get a fishing pass. They can float wherever they want. And then you have a high density rec zone layered on top of that, where you allow either unlimited or really, really high capacity in a you know, that Memorial Day to Labor Day, or does that make sense?
I'm curious how the rest of the group feels. Like if you carve out this peak period, if Brian's suggesting that there be no cap on commercial use in this period.
Oh, say that again?
No.
I don't think we
accurate.
should get to that
Okay.
question even yet.
Well, the topic today was capacities, right? And trying to, at some point, I'm not in a huge rush, but at some point we're gonna have to deal with this.
So let's go back to like uses. So you could say,
Well, wait a minute. I just want to be super clear that are you arguing that there won't be a cap on the non-commercial use in this period?
no, not at all. But what
I'm saying the same thing on the upper river will be
For the lower and
the
the
same template
lower.
for the lower.
If you
And
have a
it
permit
doesn't
for
matter.
lower, you can
Nobody's
go
gonna
back
take
and
their
forth.
peak days probably and go down and fish.
Okay, I mean, that's new to me. So
so I mean, the way,
But right, for simplicity, it's the exact same peak and shoulder season. on the
yeah,
upper
same for
end.
the whole river, but then on top of that, you have a layer in this one special zone of Warren to Gray Cliff, where then you have maybe a shorter period of time, right, from June 15 to August or to Labor Day. In that zone, you allow a unique kind of pass, right? A float rec only pass, and you allow tens of thousands of them, right?
I mean, who cares what you're doing down there? There are no fish. You can go fish if you want.
Great fishing.
Well, there are fish.
No, I'm talking about
Fish as well.
July 15. I don't know.
As soon as those fish move
July and
out,
August.
up or down.
It's been an incredible.
Okay.
Well, that's but the numbers are very, very low. You're still talking less than 10%, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Exactly.
so it may be phenomenal fishing, but who cares?
Goes back to where the crisis is, where the focal point is.
Right, you would rather have, like you said, those guys hitting warm the blacks forward than.
If it's fishing
Walking
well,
ahead.
you want people to go there,
Yeah.
right? Like it's gonna, you don't want to bar them from going there because they need a
Right.
special fishing pass to go in there. Like when it's fishing well, like have at it, like go in there and fish. That's gonna pull people from the upper in there.
Yeah, especially if it's, between June 15.
So if you wanted to keep it super simple, you say, your fishing pass lets you fish up and down the river. You could have a general rec floating pass that lets you fish. But then then you have this special high density rec floating pass in that zone from July 1 to, September 1 or June 15 to September 1. Or you could have a peak of July 1 to where it's every day of the week, and then you could have weekends only in the shoulders when the fishing is really good, where you can get kind of, but you manage that zone for huge. The only capacity limit there is worrying about the highways and people parking a mile down the road on the county roads and
Of recreation.
of the high rec area.
John's ambassador program.
Because of John's point, you want to have as many people that want to do that go there as possible until you get safety issues and
and probably do
Habitat.
And habitat
Mhm.
degradation.
That's your trigger.
That's your trigger there.
That's your trigger
It's there.
to intervene is when we see some form
It's there.
of measurable habitat degradation.
And Chris can weigh in on that. It's a little bit crazy on a July Saturday. The amount of people trying to go to one place to launch two. Once they're on the river, everybody's having fun because the more people on the river, the bigger the party. But
How's the group feeling? Good. Guys good with the peak shoulders and off peak, right? We're good with the fishing ambassador program. And Mac, you're gonna take the lead on
We'll develop a white
recommendations
paper
on that.
I'm good with March too, looking at you.
And then the flow chart, really, to me, I mean, at one point, we were talking about having a separate flow chart for the lower and one for the upper. That's all gone away now, right? Proof concurs on that.
what I would recommend is you treat one of these uses as like a high density.
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you take that for the same flow chart.
Well, maybe, or you just say that you deal with that here. I do think the group ought to make recommendations on this livery service issue in the upper. But I think we need to package that up with some other recommendations.
The livery is.
Livery is
livery?
Driving over from Moonlight with a bus full of people with inner tubes.
Right.
And they're unguided. So you deliver their watercraft.
So it's different than shuttles.
It's different than shuttles.
Okay.
Because you're also delivering their watercraft. We're renting them a watercraft, but you're delivering them the watercraft and picking it up.
Commercial non-fishing floats,
Okay.
to me,
But-
should be prohibited in the upper.
Well, then you're dealing with scenic floats.
That's guided, that's different. That should be different than livery.
Commercial.
Non-angling.
There should be non-fishing guided is, we should talk about that too, right?
Right.
Well, you should talk about actually just, you got to go back to before you break all this out and talk about these use groups, right? And do you want to have wade fishing as one use group and then floating as another? And then determine, basically, like this is what a lot of other rivers do, and they say you have X number of boats allowed on the upper Madison, or the whole river, right? Except for this high density area, and then you choose if you're floating whether you fish or not. It's really hard to have a pass that's like a float angling pass, because are you going to find someone if they're floating on the river and they don't have a fishing rod in their boat? There's nuances that come to this when you go to the management of it.
Right.
So they avoid that in other rivers. They basically say, a boat's a boat's a boat. If you got a float pass, you can fish. And
Brian, I think it's time to wrap it up.
yeah,
Well, I was trying to define or determine the difference between commercial scenic float trips and this idea of livery. It sounds like they're saying they're different, right?
well, livery's unguided. So they drop them off and they say, we'll pick you up down here at Black's
Okay.
Ford. We'll pick up your tubes.
With coolers.
There's no guides on the
Right.
trip. And so they're managed differently.
They're not
They
an
don't,
SRP,
they're not in the, they do have an SRP, they have a different SRP.
but only for the livery side.
Yes. Yeah, so they don't show up in Andrew's reports.
Okay,
They're,
but the scenics do,
because they're guided.
right?
And does that come underneath your allocation? If you're doing a scenic trip, Mike, is a fishing trip different than a scenic trip?
No,
No.
these,
So it's a
the
commercial
numbers are
trip.
the same.
Yeah, so we'll be okay.
Yeah.
We'll be okay.
And the scenics are qualified in the same SRP as a fishing outfitter?
A day is a day.
Okay.
Boats,
Day is a
boats.
day, okay.
Yeah, it's a guided trip.
And if you wanted to, could you take like 6 folks with inner tubes and float them partway and then drop them off?
I think so, it counts as 5 people. If there were some, I forget which ranch it was doing on the Beaverhead was doing that. They had 3 guys on 2 boats,
Oh, yeah.
attached to the drip boat, the drip boat permit. And so he was it was a circus. I got pictures of it.
But the reality is, the guided trips, if we treat them off, like, that's gonna be limited.
Part of their day.
And so there's not gonna be room for growth there.
Right.
Right, but the livery service is a different kind of business model, so we do have to address whether there's gonna be allowance for that outside of the high density zone. And then in the high density zone, you'll have to have a separate, like, this business is allowed 100 launches per hour or something, or every, that's typically done on rivers, other rivers. Michigan, in Michigan, they have livery service.
Does the commission have the authority to ban a business model like livery service geographically? That would seem like a real stretch to me.
What if you just don't offer SRPs for that?
The liveries don't have an SRP, but they're permitted separately. We do have those numbers. Cheryl mentioned it briefly at the last meeting.
It is an SRP.
It's a different SRP.
It's a different
than-
SRP.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
So
like,
what you're proposing, or what the potential solution would be, is to don't issue that form of SRP for use in the upper river. I mean, that would be if that was the direction we decided to go, that would be work.
Right.
You could basically say that the river's already a capacity for boats with the current, right? So, there's guided boats, there's unguided.
Okay,
there's
but
unguided.
Back at some point, the lower with this free-for-all approach is going to be pretty unpleasant, right? You're going to be bumping into people all day long, and they're going to be looking for other places to do.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But I was looking for the mechanism, and that sounds like one exists.
Well, the next Lake Havasu.
Evidently, there's large growth with Big Sky community on this flood tubing thing. For them, it might be faster to get to the upper. Anyway, I think it's worthy of at least some discussion.
Thanks for the time, livery.
Any other dialogue tonight?
Do we have a next meeting?
That's my next topic.
Okay.
Yeah, so we-
Commissioner Walsh,
Yes.
I just mentioned, at the last meeting, you got a report from Don. He's working on getting the written report for everyone. That will be available by the end of the year. So we might not have it, just with the holidays and everything, we might not have it posted to the team site until January. But that report will include delivery service information. It won't have all of the video footage, the camera footage of the boat counts. That won't be available, I think Andrew says, till probably March. By the time we get through that, I think it's like 18,000 hours of footage we've got to go through. But we'll get you all the report from Dawn. It'll be finished by the end of the year. It might not be up on your website till January.
Right. So is there any coordination between Cheryl and Christine?
Yep.
Because at that meeting last week, they ran 7 cameras. They have the same issues. They can't identify guide boats and not guide boats. They use total boats minus SRP. And I was like, we just went through this at our meeting. And at some point, if we need a different identifier on boats for guide boats that are discernible in a camera, if this is the technique we're using going forward on all rivers and containment. Yellowstone had the same issue. And
Chip them. Chip them.
Yeah, or like, they use for toll bridges, but as long as they talk to each other.
Yeah, Chrissy and Cheryl work really close together, but that is a standard problem.
All right, in Alaska, they run those giant numbers.
Yeah.
We could chip the boats like we chip fish and just count them as they're going by.
Using pit tags and at the
Pit
ramp,
tags.
That's a real wild greed, man.
We can do that. We'll just put a pit tag reader out there.
That's right.
Actually, what we should do is chip the guides.
Chip the guides.
Chip right behind the ear.
I knew that was cool. Like you did COVID shots this year, right? Didn't they chip that?
Yeah, that's
Just let me
already
know.
happening.
We can make it happen.
How about January per meeting? We've got the next commission meeting's on February 4th.
All right, so.
I'm gone from January 3rd to the 15th.
Good, I'm
Okay.
gone from the 5th to the 15th.
I'm gone in that zone too.
And of course, you guys will all be coming to Logan Winter Convention.
We're all coming back with suntans. So.
And how about in the zone of the 20th, 21st?
That works.
I can't make that.
Okay, what can you make, Mac?
Well, I mean, I'm good the 3rd through the 7th, I'm good through the 10th to the 12th. I'm good for the 24th to the 28th. But we got Safari Club International is the 19th,
Oh,
the
right.
20th, and our winter convention is the 13th to the 15th.
How about the week of the 24th? I mean, that's
Yep.
fine for me.
Yeah.
I'm wide open.
I got,
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, man, if you're not leaving until,
I gotta see what day
I'm good all the 10, I'm good all of
Well, you're gonna
2022.
come to the convention anyway.
I have some.
Chris McGrath, are you good in that zone the week of the 24th?
You just walk.
I'm good any day
I
that
can
week.
do the Monday or the Tuesday. Then I'm out of the country.
How about Tuesday, the 25th, or?
No, I'm flying that day. I can do Monday, the 24th, and then I'm out.
I can do the 24th.
I can.
I can.
You can?
Yes.
24th, everyone?
Going once, going twice.
Okay, so 124. What I've got for that is a review of the Big Hole and Beaverhead. Key learnings. I've got conclusion on this peak, non-peak shoulder. I'd like to really make sure that the other members of the group are all bought in on that, members of the community. Update on the FAS tour. I hope that'll happen for this next meeting.
I was volunteering for that.
Yeah, I think Mike was in on it.
Brian and Mike and I.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
We can do.
I think you guys could, John, I think you guys could accomplish a heck of a lot with Jay in that tour.
Who's doing the tour? John and who else?
Mike Bias.
Bias.
And
Do you guys have the contact info for Jade Poppy?
maybe you did give it to me, Casey. Yeah. Let me see.
If you don't, I can get that to you.
Yeah, it would be best.
More importantly, I'm trying to coordinate that with Hope first to make sure she's good with the game plan.
She's fine with the tour going ahead.
She is. okay.
Yep, so I know Hope's not got any time in the near future.
She doesn't need to go.
Yep, so the best thing
Yeah,
is for Mike and John to coordinate directly with Jay.
I'll make sure you guys get his
That'd be
contact.
great.
info.
Yeah,
And if we gotta do it before things like the Ennis boat ramp get ice on the skin.
Yeah, he's out, most of the staff are out this week, and I'm not sure what his plans are next week, but
Yeah.
See, what's the date we're supposed to have this one?
Yeah. I think he was,
You tell me, January, yeah, I mean, at least to start on it by January
You
24th.
already got it done.
Yeah. Just need to know when you're handing it in.
John,
Yes.
Jay is available next week for a tour,
Okay,
so.
so am I.
Yeah, if you guys want to
Mike,
just
Are you available next week for the tour?
contact Jay. I think he's gonna be out looking at some construction projects.
Great.
At the
I'm
FAS.
available
anyway.
all next week. That's great.
So just hook up with Jay.
And Casey, you'll send me his contact, please.
I will.
Thank you so much.
Okay, want to take a look at a meeting date in February? It would be late February, sometime in March.
He's doing the next meeting. I have no idea.
Me neither.
My whole February is wide open, man.
Well, you got.
I'm with you.
Valentine's Day on the 14th. I'm
February,
sure you got a full schedule.
Yeah.
I'd say we wouldn't want to meet too soon after the last meeting. How about the week of February 21st?
Oh, me.
I think so.
I'm
Allison, Dan,
I'm open.
Brian,
Just for your reference, the 21st is President's Day for
okay.
our
How about
government officials.
February
but
24th?
That Thursday night?
Yeah, Thursday night.
I know.
Works for me.
We're in a
Okay
roll.
with me.
Check your calendars. I'll send around meeting invites for those 2 dates. And then we'll work on the agenda for the,
6 o'clock on all these, or you want to try earlier with the bad weather and
I'm open to anything. I can be flexible.
what does everybody want?
We have some people that are traveling further than
Yeah.
those of us that are resident here, so I'm open, I'm flexible.
Earlier is better, obviously.
How early?
Doesn't matter.
Like 4?
I'm a paid guy.
Yeah.
You're shaking your head at me.
Yeah, it's,
Oh, it's the meeting room thing.
yeah, it's,
Oh, right.
it's much, 6 is much easier for us, to be honest, sorry. It's, yeah, 5:30
Things are
south.
gonna be.
Oh, it
For
is?
us
Okay.
coming
6.
down from Helena, to be honest.
Okay, 6. 6 it is.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Nice try.
So January 24th and February 24th, is that
Yes.
the dates you settled on?
Yep.
Okay, I'll get that set up.
Thank you. Okay, so any other comments from the work group?
I've done a big workup of BH2 for the NRC meetings.
I think that'd be great. Let's plan the application on that. That would be good. Now, and my thought was to invite Eric Thorson, and
Talk to him.
he was excited to participate.
All right.
I want to open it up to public comment. I know you had a comment.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Jared Arnold. I got Brian. I just want to kind of get back to something that was mentioned over there that, this is the nuts and the bolts of the social issue. I think you defined the peak season, which is great. And, we can, Brian's talking about the capacity there that, there's a number of days that non-commercial and commercial users, that we're, going to come up with at later discussions. You guys will come up with that number. And I want to say for the peaks or the non-peak seasons, there's some additional growth possible there. I think you mentioned that, whether it's 30%, 50% or something. But one thing I wanted to say is that, these are the big important things that we're looking at. But when you do make the cap, it's not, people aren't just going to stop coming to fish Gallatin Valley. So what happens to those 50, 5,000, 10,000 users that can't float the river, can't get a pass, whatever it is? Where do they go? Where does that pressure end up? It could end up in the Bear Track Canyon. That's because people are like, well, hey, we don't need a float permit to go here. And those are the little things that maybe look at when you do put the caps on, where's that pressure going to go? Well, those people are still going to come, but where's it going to end up? What problem might be created from that? And just one comment I had. Excellent.
Mhm.
Do you?
Yellowstone.
So do you
I know, that's what I was
From
thinking.
what you heard, do you agree with our definition of seasonality in the upper river that you showed?
Oh, absolutely. I've been a guy for 16 years. I've lived here my entire life. And I think those windows fit really, really well.
Perfect. And then you would, you do support the notion of regulating public use?
Absolutely. I think, we've regulated public use before. We used to shut down sections of the Madison River. Streams used to close, from something like October 1st to the third weekend in May or whatever. So, residents are already used to that sort of closures. The non-residents might not understand that, but I think, like the group, the ambassador group, and just more education, maybe some sort of.
And from your point of view on the ambassador program, does that sound like a viable?
It does. And one issue that came up that, is you've got how you implement that. You've got long-time guides, that have been doing it 15, 20 years, are those the people that you need to focus the energy on? How do you, at the boat ramp, how do you go, okay, these are the people who know what they're doing, and these are the people that don't know what they're doing. And I can see some conflict. I don't know how they did it in Kalispell, but it's just on Facebook, hey, this is, but I mean, one thing I thought of that'd be real easy is just do a short video of, 5 or 6 boats gearing up and putting them on the river, like, the ethics of that, or whatever, if that's the issue you're trying to address. Exactly, right? Just, gear up, all, don't do it all on the ramp. Exactly right.
Any other public comment? Yeah, John?
I just I heard some great comments and great information being used and questions being asked. And my concern and the foundation's concern is the entire river, from Yellowstone National Park where it exits and down to the conference in Three Forks. And so I think that as we're talking about a recreational carrying capacity and cap and use for all groups, I think that needs to be considered. Talking about cap one thing and you spread that pressure to the shoulders, or you push them to a different section. And so keeping in mind that if we leave a free-for-all, whether it's for tubers or anglers or whoever in one section of the river, just like we experienced with food owls, you can drive those folks to go someplace else and put that free-for-all use and then be a greater environmental impact. That being said, right now, one of the largest regulatory groups and commissions in the United States considers the lower river from Bear Trap down to be impacted environmentally. And so therefore, in their license to operate to Northwest Energy, they currently require certain things to happen and they trigger releases of water out of Hebgen based out of that environmental impact that's happening with temperature and increases in air and water temps. So for us to push a higher group of users to that area is a little bit scary to me personally, from that standpoint, because it is impacted and it's already being regulated on the flows and how that flow from clear upstream is impacted by what's happening at that lower section and what's coming out of Ennis Lake. So don't forget that that is a highly impacted section. And I know that the biologists, I've had discussions with Mike and others, they will report very similar things, that there is habitat degradation, and not just by put in and takeouts, but by the user groups in general. And so there's that FERC license, the DSS protocol that's heavily used in that area. And then as far as like the rafting and the livery and stuff like that, it already exists in the upper river. We see it very heavily in Ennis. We see those people coming up and going into, say, Burnt Tree or 8 Mile, places like that, and pulling out of town. It's there. And part of the reason why it's there, but not as bad, is the water temps. So the longer we keep those water temps cold, and if we can lower the water temps below Bear Trap, you'll see less people wanting to be in their swim trunks in those waters because it's cold and it's not as enjoyable when it's lukewarm in bathtub. So it's happening, and as we go through global warming and temperature increases in the overall length of the river, we're going to see people being more and more comfortable doing and using that. So yeah, be careful of the displacement aspect, and that's kind of what I got.
So you think it's livery services at those access sites, or just recreationals that have rented it somewhere else and bringing it there?
Yeah, I've talked to people who, Mike was talking about the float tubers or the pontoon boat folks that were on a guide's docket. I mean, I know folks that are guides and people that float up personally that will load up a bunch of inner tubes and rafts for their friends and family, and they'll make a good fun day. And they'll send whoever down to just fun float and sunbathe while they'll stay behind and then start to fish as they come down. And that may not be a guide that does that, but people enjoy those stretches for a less focused recreation as far as fishing goes, and more of that. But there's not a lot, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's still cold water, and so they're not having those beach parties and then large groups coming down as much. But they're there, and it's.
Yeah, I would agree. You see the recreation. I just haven't seen like a service providing that.
I that would be something to talk to Rocket and some of those others to see
Okay.
if there's people that are shuttling that way. But it's not a difficult family shuttle to go from 8 Mile or Burnt Tree down to the bridge and down to town. So.
And you wouldn't necessarily borrow that kind of, but a recreation plan can set limits.
Correct.
And so you can set limits that are, where you don't allow an explosion of that one form of use. You could, allow some of it, but
Yeah,
those are all things that a
it's
recreation
built
plan.
in the basis of the EA and that conflict model. You have to take that into consideration, right? Of those user groups then all of a sudden having a conflict they didn't have before.
Understand.
But at the same time, environmentally responsible activities, protecting the other sections of the river by putting that full cap on total recreation.
Well, John, thanks for being here. Thank you all. Scott, any comments?
No,
Okay.
I talk to you guys in between the meetings, so I'll just be mindful of everybody's time. Get us home.
Well, thanks for writing that article.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
I know, Mike said, no, yeah, he's like, sorry for that. Yeah, it just goes slow.